It is my great pleasure to say hello to everybody and welcome to this first episode of our online seminar series called Revisiting 10 Key TANTlab Papers. I am very pleased to see a lot of familiar faces as well as people I haven't met before. That is just what we hope for. And I should also say that we are recording this, so we will hopefully reach even more people later. We will put the recording on our website. My name is Torben Elgaard Jensen. I'm a professor of science and technology studies, and I'm the leader of the Techno-Anthropology lab here in Copenhagen and also covering Aalborg. I'm one of the three hosts on this seminar series. The two other hosts are Mathieu Jacomy, who will give a wave. Mathieu is an engineer and a developer of digital tools and an assistant professor in TANTlab. And my other co-host is Matt Artz. Give them a wave. Matt is situated in Baltimore in the US, where he works as an AI product manager at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Matt is a great friend of the lab and also a bit of a mover and a shaker in the American field of applied anthropology. So that's us. Next question is, why are we doing this seminar series? Why are we revisiting 10 key TANTlab papers one at a time? The quick answer is, of course, that we academics, so we love papers. We read and write papers for a living. But the most serious answer is that we believe that these 10 papers that we have picked raise questions rather than settle questions. Since 2012, the Techno-Anthropology lab has been in the midst of discussions about digital and participatory methods and of how to do science and technology studies and anthropology of technology in our contemporary world. So we've been asking questions like, how do we follow and engage with the increasing digitization and digital mediation of our societies? How do we mobilize digital tools and digital phenomena as a resource for our work? And what kind of stories do we want to tell about life in the digital Anthropocene? The selected papers, we believe, offer different inroads to these important discussions, but the papers are only one resource. More importantly, we also have the authors of the papers with us. With them, we hope to really bring out the interesting issues. We begin each of these seminars with an author interview. Matt will interview one of the authors of that day's paper. In the case of today, I will be the author that is being interviewed. And he will sort of try to tease out how the authors think about the issue raised in the paper and how the issue may perhaps have moved or look differently today. After the interview session, we will invite all of you to join the discussion. Before handing over to Matt, let me just briefly introduce today's paper. The paper is from 2021 and introduces a neologism called Participatory Data Design, also abbreviated as PDD. It was published in as a book chapter in a book called Making and Doing, Activating STS Through Knowledge, Expression and Travel, edited by Gary Downey and Toyn Sudaran-Dirac. And the full title of the paper is Participatory Data Design, Acting in a Digital World. The authors, in addition to me, are Andreas Birkbak, Anders Kod Madsen, and Anders Christian Munk. And since, as I mentioned, I'm the first author of this paper, I will be the subject for Matt's interview. But and the other co-authors are not here. Perhaps they'll jump in later. Who knows? So anyway, without further ado, a warm welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining this online session, and over to you, Matt.
Great, thanks, Torben, and thanks all again for joining. So, I want to get into the questions here, but as a quick preamble to that, I guess I just want to say, from somebody who's looked from the outside into the lab, I think I myself and many of colleagues that I know, we really appreciate the work you're all doing to help innovate in this space. And so much of that work has been instructive and been important for many years, but maybe arguably increasingly important given the context that we're in at the moment. And so really look forward to the opportunity to engage with you all on these papers and have this discussion today. And one of the things that has always jumped out at me when I've looked at many of these papers, including the participatory data design paper, is the focus on process, going beyond tools, helping all of us who read these papers and learn from them to sort of see the messiness of the process, right? The sort of situated practices and how knowledge is constructed and how this is a valuable approach, but one that is not always as easy as it might sometimes seem in some write-ups, right? And so look forward to getting into, not just with this paper, but many of them, the approach, the lessons learned, and particularly today, Torben, I guess I'd like to start with, why did you and the other authors even get interested in the idea of participatory data design? Where did that come from?
Yeah, it's something that I think if I say it was something that grew on us, I would sort of suggest that it came slowly. It was more like we had a rather frantic period from I think around 2014, where there are lots of experiments in the lab with trying to do what we call data sprints. Some of the impetus for this was that Anders Christian Munk had been visiting the Media Lab at Sciences Po in Paris 2 years prior to that. And he was the Media Lab, but we were also really interested in using digital methods in some kind of way to further some kind of engaged humanistic research. So when Anders returned, he brought home with him ideas and connections, and in a span of a few years, we did a lot of these data sprints projects with external stakeholders, where we try to engage with them and together with them look at different kinds of data and try to build different kinds of things. And the overall thrust of these projects that use digital methods was that in the early years, and I'm here speaking about sort of early projects, European projects, like around 2008 perhaps, there was the idea that use digital methods and create something, and then the public will appreciate it a bit afterwards. But then increasingly, it was realized that you need to bring stakeholders or publics in earlier in the process. So there was more and more projects that try to bring external stakeholders, we call them issue experts, into the engine room and try to engage them in looking at the data and thinking about what to do with it and how to make sense of it. And those projects that took place in TANTlab was very much those kinds of projects where we had seminars or events where the issue experts were present the entire time and involved in the process. And then I think at some point the term participatory data design was invented as a bit of an accident. I had got the news from my head of department that there was some kind of money being dished out. And I was trying to say, okay, of course we wanted some of that money. And then my strategy was just to team up with someone from another research group, because if two research groups had a common words, then perhaps we could sort of get a share of that money. So together with a neighboring research group that also had, they have worked a lot with bringing data out to school teachers. Then we just came up with the term participatory data design. As it turned out, it was all just a misunderstanding. We never got any of that money, but the term stuck with us, participatory data design, because it sort of emphasizes that the participatory aspects, and it also ties a link to this Scandinavian tradition for participatory design and user engagement. So we kind of like the label, and we use that more and more to talk about what we were doing. And then at some point we were invited to write this book chapter, because word had gotten out that we were doing something called participatory data design. And that's the background for the text. But it was really about a group of us trying to get our heads around what was there sort of a common denominators for the practices or the data sprints that we've been running. Could we tease out were there some principles or some ideas that we could articulate clearer in a more clear way, or were there sort of strategies we could tease out, and could we tell the rest of the world about the intended and unintended consequences of involving people in looking at data?
Great, thanks. And considering this video will be online, after this, I know today we have a local crowd, but considering it will be online, just could you very briefly maybe share also, you mentioned the history of Scandinavian participatory design more broadly. How embodied is that in like ingrained is that in the sort of anthropological and STS practice there before you were maybe sort of bringing it in this capacity? Is that normative? Were you doing something different? How might other programs around the world even think about that?
I think in Denmark, if you look at the different STS research groups there are, many of them have grown, or at least two important of them have grown up at IT universities or IT departments, where they have sort of invested a lot of investment in participatory design and those kinds of methods. And also in general, I think perhaps more STS than anthropology in Denmark has been very interested in how can you study users and make them contribute to design in various types of ways. So there's always been a sort of strong affiliation between participatory design practices and STS, although not that many STS scholars would call themselves participatory designers. But it's clearly visible as a practice and also a sort of a democratic ambition and a meaningful way of approaching and engaging users of technology, also as a way of understanding new perspectives of technology.
Thanks. And something I know I would love to see more here in the States. Coming back to something you said in the first response, you mentioned, principles, right? So you talk about, one that jumps out at me, right, is the difference between digitization and datafication. Would you mind just sort of, in this process, would you mind elaborating on the differences of that and how you sort of came to view datafication as you do today?
Yeah. So digitization is simply the process of making a digital copy of something that was not digital before. And that is, of course, something that has been going on a lot and has been a part of the impetus for all the digital developments. But what is so the example we use in the text is that if you have an old parchment, an old manuscript, then you can have a digital copy and then you can read it without damaging it. But the more interesting thing is that when you have a digitized copy of something, then what can you do with that? So can you possibly scan it so you can recognize the characters, and then you can start to make word count, so you can make sentiment analysis and so on. So whenever you have digitized something, there is in principle a cascade of other opportunities that open up following that, because the digitized data can be analyzed or moved about or categorized or visualized in a variety of different ways. So everybody, from the 2000s or whenever said that, now we have a lot of stuff that is digitized, but the real importance of that is to say, what can we do with it? And data sprints are tapping into that opportunity by saying, is there something? Can we make choices in terms of how we look at the data, how we visualize the data, what kind of semantic analysis software do you use to, for instance, identify semantic clusters in textual material and so on. So the datafication is about exploring the different cascades of stuff you can do on top of digitization. And there are many routes to go, and that's exactly why it's important to bring in issue experts who can help you ask the right questions or frame the right build the right frame of mind to look at the data.
Okay, thanks for expanding on that. And so the datafication and the flexible visualization, and then the materialization that you speak of in there, all of those, right, there are challenges when working with issue experts. You certainly touch on a number of those throughout the work and especially in the discussion, but would you mind just sort of helping unpack that? Like, what are some of the considerations and challenges when you're working through this methodologically?
I think, I mean, there are several, but I can just mention sort of one of the more dramatic challenges that Anders Kuhl and Anders Munk came across in a project they did in the municipality of Aalborg, where they were involved in orchestrating several public debates about a new school reform. So they involved teachers and parents and all sorts of others into discussing how should a new school reform be implemented. This was at a very politically fraught moment. There had been a really strong conflict between the national government and the trade unions over the school reforms. And in that process, they were both very successful in getting a lot of people to debate the school reform and use Facebook to as a frame to do that, and also in bringing out the sort of various patterns and topics in that discussion and displaying it back to people to further the discussion. But what they also realized as they went along is that part of the way that field had been organized before was that the teachers union was speaking sort of unanimously and in an authoritative voice about, what is good and bad about how to organize the school, and the municipality was sort of their counterparty. And as the project moved on, it sort of became clear that the idea of bringing so many different voices in, and in a sense giving them an even space, sort of watered out some of the authority and the punch of the teachers union. So that's an example of how you can move into a space, you can involve stakeholders in doing something with data, but then you can quickly become sort of exposed to the types of dynamics or conflicts of interest that are already going on in the field. And suddenly you can be mobilized, for instance, by one party to, in principle, undermine the teachers' union's voice. I don't think it was that bad, but still, it was something that was potentially an outcome of that project. So that at least tells you that there is no that there is more danger than purity, so to speak, in this field, because once you get involved with stakeholders, they have a more knowledge than you have. Once you produce visualizations and other digital products, they can travel around the organizations. It's sort of a much messier and uncontrollable process than if you just decide to go out, study something by some kind of stealth process, go back to your office and write a paper about it. Instead, you get yourself heavily entangled with other strong participants. So that's something that needs to be thought about and managed. And I don't think there are any principled solutions to that. The only principle I can come up with is that it's better to be in the midst and in the mess of things than to be at a distance and just have opinions about it. So I very much believe in engaged humanities as a practice and as a political mission, even though it can put us in uncomfortable situations.
And of course, later in the series, we'll look at the critical proximity paper, which will be a great discussion as well. But coming back to that point of traveling, so and building on what you just said, right? That there's two sides to that. It opens up the ability of us to have greater influence, right, and to enact and make and have an impact in the world. But it does still create this problem, like, you talk about, say, the assets, the artifacts traveling and maybe not being able to control that sort of, or at least participate in that conversation after that point. And so, like, when we materialize and bring, something such as a map, or some kind of artifact into be, um, I guess what I'd like to maybe know there is, given your experience with these projects beyond, I know you just said that, like, it's maybe hard to put a principle around that, but have you learned anything since the publication of this, of maybe how to manage that a little bit, right? How to sort of ensure that the artifacts that we're creating are understood by audiences that we may impact.
Mm, I think the if I look at this paper from now, I think one the place that this has really traveled is into a professional master education that we are running. So a professional master is for people who are in jobs out there in the world, but come back to the university for 4 semesters to have a part-time education. And we're running a master education called Data-Driven Organizational Development. And as a part of that, we encourage our students or our participants to arrange something of a small data sprint inspired by this with people in their companies. So that means that the situation is not that we as academics seek out stakeholders or collaborators and then on to the next project. Instead, you have the situation where someone in an organization who might be committed to developing a particular field does a participatory data design project as a part of a longer effort to push a certain agenda or move things in a certain direction. So that also means that the person will somehow stay in the organization and the knowledge about it will stay there. And it sort of gives a different setup for how both for what is a project like this or what is a data sprint, but also about how is it used or how is it followed up. So I think that sort of builds, in a sense, a kind of stability and commitment around both what is going on in the data sprint, but also what can come out of it or how will it be followed up. So I think that's a meaningful and also an interesting way that this has developed, and we hear lots of interesting stories from our students about how people in their organizations have responded to this and try to work with it.
Great, thanks. And that reminds me of something I often tell folks that I talk to, who are maybe earlier in their career, who want to practice. Often, like, say, if I'm talking to people who work in UX, since I work in tech, I'm often telling them that almost more of the job is the education and the communication that happens after the research that we do, making sure that we have to stay in front of people so that they don't become artifacts, sort of, shelfware, as we sometimes call it, right? Just work up on the shelf.
Hmm.
And find that constant kind of communication to remind people that research exists and that these were the findings, and these insights might impact something that we're working on now, is critical to that. And so the program and the fact that all those folks are now bringing it back into industry sounds really fantastic and like a great program overall. I guess what I'd be curious then to know is, sort of in building on that last question just a little bit, are you changing the way you're approaching the process, as you continue to mature the program and do more of these, right? Are there new techniques, new processes, new learnings that are coming in that are shifting the practice from when you wrote it up?
Mm. I think there's an important technical development in the sense that when the data sprints we describe here depended on certain generation of tools and it required a lot of technical skills to handle the data and, for instance, create the visuals and so on. But what we have sort of realized also through the comparison with participatory design is that it's really important to have sort of tools for rapid prototyping that people can get their hands on. So in a classic participatory design project, you could imagine having sort of a model made of Lego bricks and then have people standing around the table discussing where to put the walls of the new offices and so on. And in a sense, in a way similar to that, Mathieu, for instance, have been working on building what he calls datascapes, which are interfaces to data that allow normal users to quickly type in some search words and visualize some stuff or dive into the material and so on. So a datascape is really a custom-made interface to data that makes it explorable and manipulable for people who don't have sort of technical skills in advance. So those in later projects where we have used sort of datascapes, which is sort of you could say sort of also a more polished way of engaging with the data, that has quickly spurred the sort of the interest and the experimental mindset of participants, because then people just try stuff out and see what it looks like and so on. So there's an important development in terms of basically how do we serve the data or how do we prepare the opportunities to engage with it at these events.
Great. Certainly be interested in seeing some of that at some point. But maybe one final thing, and then we're probably close to wanting to open it up for other questions. But in the paper, there is a section on there's a brief sentence that stuck out to me as unhelpful dichotomies, and it was like qualitative versus quantitative, and description versus intervention, online versus offline, and technical insiders versus outsiders. I found that, that stuck out to me because I do feel like we often get in these debates when, again, in some sense, it is much messier in many ways, particularly between the online and offline, right, of our lives today.
Hmm.
Any sort of last thoughts around those dichotomies that you put forth in the paper a few years ago? Any new ones that you see? Any changes to your thinking on that particular line?
This is a question I shouldn't answer no to, but I think I would stand by that opinion that we are sort of messing around with those categories. And I think most importantly, it's there has been and still is the idea that with a lot of data comes a lot of sort of clear objectivity. And also that a lot of data is somehow sort of a quantitative way of describing the world. But the way that everything that we're doing at these data sprints is in a sense saying that it's very much a matter of framing questions differently, looking at data differently, and it's also a matter of making, even though there is quantification as a part of these tools, it is a quantitative strategy. So there's so we're exploring big data sets, but we're exploring them in a qualitative way, looking for patterns or connections or inspiration to ask new questions. So there is so everything is not just moving towards some kind of mechanical quantified precision with big data. Instead, it can just as well move towards facilitating a space for asking interesting qualitative questions and question your own assumptions or discover patterns in the data that could lead to new questions and so on. So that's the space that we were dabbling in then and that we're still dabbling in, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I guess my last comment on that, again, going back to so many of the papers, right? It's often showing that data is not fixed and, always negotiated, right? There's always a process of sort of meaning making, and so much of this is contested. And that's, again, one of the, some of those big meta themes that pop out of many of the papers through the program that I've always appreciated. And so thanks for responding to those questions. We're more or less at time of where we wanted to be to open it up. So I guess we'd invite anybody else who might want to jump in with a question or comment. Just come off mute should anybody wish to. Yeah, Laura, jump in.
Hi, I'm David. Nice to meet you, Matt.
My pleasure.
I'm a PhD from the lab, pretty new. I was wondering with the datafication process, I didn't get from this paper, you talk about having the participants identify or issue experts identify what's important, what are important data aspects. But say, for instance, the Twitter, do they know how the data is constructed and how much knowledge do they have to know about how the data that then they select what's important from that? How does that process work and feed into datafication? Is there a danger that without that knowledge that they might choose things that are not necessarily important?
I think in practical terms, with all these events, there were pre-meetings with the participants or some of the participants talking about, what kind of data should we generate or harvest as a part of this process. But the specific one with the Danish Board of Technology, I was not involved in that, but I doubt they had sort of necessarily a deep knowledge about what is the genre of Twitter and what would you get in that specific data dump, and also that can be sometimes difficult to figure out if there are sort of hidden things in the way the API works. So there is, I think, we are in the situation here where the usefulness and the quality of data is something that needs to be reflected upon and settled along the way, or so you have to believe in certain things also. It's not something that we can, neither our nor the participants' knowledge can guarantee in some kind of way. But I think also in what lies behind in this sort of efforts, I think we write something like the first thing we do is to datafy the phenomenon. And that's sort of a bet in a sense, which we decide we want to work with something. And then we say, okay, let's harvest, a lot of the data we can get our hands on. And then let's explore during the workshop if we can use that to generate some kind of meaningful understanding. So we don't know it in advance. Is it good data? Can something be done with it? That's kind of the bets. That's what we try during those workshops. And we at best we know afterwards.
I think Klaus, you were next.
Well, yeah, thanks. And thank you for opening up for this discussion about what's behind the paper as well. And actually, I wanted to follow up on Matt's excellent issue about the way in which you seek to get beyond these unhelpful dichotomies, because I really see the way in which you're trying to get beyond the quantitative divide as you were just describing as well. But I was actually a bit in doubt as how you yourself would articulate the way in which you get beyond the distinction between online and offline. If you would just add a few words to the ways in which you feel you transgress that dichotomy with these methods. Just give me a better sense of the ways in which you think this transgresses that distinction. So I'm not just imposing my own thoughts.
Uh, that's a a damn good question because um, also when I reread it, I was sort of I was thinking about how exactly are we doing that? I think one way to think about this is to say that the fact that you, for instance, do a project in a municipality in the room with people who are stakeholders in a particular debate is somehow, uh, you know, also creating a physical process where certain people are meeting and debating and seeing each other. And some of this is reflected online and tossed back at them. So in a sense, that transgresses a situation where sort of in a caricature of media studies, you just only harvest what is in some media and make your analysis based on that. Instead, it is about you study it by being out there with the stakeholders or having the stakeholders who will carry this on or who carry knowledge about their organizations and what would be interesting and whatnot into the situation. So I think that is the sense in which this transgresses or at least plays with the dichotomy between online and offline, simply be through the participant, the physical presence of the participants in the lab or the physical presence of people from the lab in the context of the participants. But it's not, I think that's my best answer to that. But I think we might have been overstating it a little bit in that introduction. I would be willing to accept that, but I think that is the point where we're playing with that boundary.
But then I am in line with what you were thinking, because I was thinking of this in terms of a bit like what Stine Lomborg and Munk and others talk about, giving people a data mirror and then seeing your data becomes a way of also, transgressing into their offline worlds. But I just wanted to be sure I was not pushing too much of my own thinking into yours. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. Who's next? Matt, do you have an overview? Or?
I think I am.
Yes.
Think I am next. I am interested in hearing you about what we can learn from your work on participatory data design, but applied to generative AI. And my motivation for asking this is that first, participatory design is about a dialogue, right? And then if you throw data in, often you will be mediating data, but also computations to people who, without you, would not have access to these technologies or to that kind of data and in that way. So I think often it may look a little bit magical, just to summarize, to put it simply. And so this dialogue about something a little bit magical, where you've been there, you've been seeing what happens, it seems eerily similar to someone in front of ChatGPT now. So what's the lesson here, if you have one?
I think I really don't have a clear answer to this one. I think the the field of working with data with or without AI has been quickly evolving over the several decades in terms of what are the tools for harvesting or visualizing, for instance, what kind of data can you get access to? Suddenly there was a bonanza moment, and then there was a more proprietary moment. And AI is again a medium that makes sort of creates possible connections to all sorts of data, although in quite strange ways. And it's also a tool for both generating and harvesting a lot of stuff, and also a tool that furthers a lot of interaction. So I think through all this, we need to always try to land on our speed and try to say, okay, we need to build some kind of, we need to ask the right questions or build some kind of communities around who is it that is supposed to use data or AI tools for something meaningful. So in a sense, some of the sort of old political missions of participatory design was to say those who will be affected by the technology should also have a stake in discussing how we design it or develop it and implement it. And in the same sense, I think I have no recipe for what to do with AI, but I think this might entail a recipe for who, meaning that the affected people and our intuition in this paper is always to side with people who can use data to further and enhance their own work, as opposed to sort of a new public management setup, whereas you're asked to deliver data to someone high above you in the organization who can then use that to control you back. So there would be some sort of commitment here to local engagement and local governance with data. But I can't really necessarily translate that into how to plan in detail an AI project. But it's a great question.
Fair enough. Thank you. I will be saying who's next if Matt doesn't see it. The next one is Mathieu.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Mathieu, you're on mute, but thanks for joining from New York. Good to see you.
There we go. Torben, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the technical aspects of how you're creating these network diagrams, how you're moving and manipulating them, what kind of program languages you're using, whether that's R or Python. Maybe that's evolved with some of the developments with AI. So that's one question about just how you're creating your network diagrams, if you could get into a little bit of the technical aspect of that. And then I'll just work this question in as well. I don't know if you're familiar with this work Bit by Bit by Solganik, but he talks about some of the problems of big data, like what he calls algorithmic confounding, just that the data itself is often driven by the engineering goals of the system itself. And so that can introduce, you could say bias or other types of issues with the data. It's not pure data and so forth. So maybe if you could address that issue as well, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
I would just say something briefly to your last question, and then I will hand it over to Mathieu, who's really the technical expert. I'm so happy you're here today, Mathieu. So I'm sure you can answer that. So the question about being, I don't know that specific reference, but the question about being confounded by data is something that is always a risk. I think in some of the projects we have sort of been so fortunate that the stakeholders are the ones who can sort of help us decipher what are the biases and inherent choices in the data in a way that we definitely could not ourselves. So for instance, I wrote a recent paper with someone from the emergency services in Copenhagen, those who put out fires, and he had run a data sprint with some of his colleagues, and where they had these emergency calls that had been transcribed, and some of the quality was bad, but they were completely able to see through it and know what parts of it could be trusted and what could not be and what could never have been said and so on. So sometimes the involvement of stakeholders can help us a little bit on that sort of much bigger issue about being confounded and data and data bias. But Mathieu, will you tell something about what are the tools we're working with or have been working with?
Very shortly, and we can have a longer discussion, but maybe in another seminar. But so I think that one of the key ways to do map-like visualizations when you don't have like spatial data like towns and stuff like this is to do network visualization. That's my specialty. Usually you would do that because you can extract some form of relations from your data, and then you would apply a layout that tries to put the data points that are more connected together and essentially draws the clusters. But There are other ways to do that. Nowadays, we could do that with, for example, text embeddings and dimensionality reduction. If I just take a step back and I talk about why we would use map-like visualizations in a setting like participatory data design, I think that the modern understanding of this is that we don't want to reduce too much, because when you reduce, you make choices that bring in your own vision of what is at stake. And the point of participatory data design is to let people involve their own preconceptions, what they think is important in the data and so on. And this is never given. So you need another way of visualizing data where you take less decision, a way that is more agnostic, a way that does not cut the categories, for example. And one of the virtues of doing these visualizations is that you can have not clear-cut categories, you can rediscuss the boundaries between your categories, typically. So that would be a key thing in this setting.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just point out the discussion on filtering, right, which goes to that last point, discussion in the paper, particularly useful. It's, I find myself when working, with any of the technology, the decisions you make, of course, have big impacts. And I'd be curious some other time to get into it with embeddings because of how lossy and how kind of compressed really is. I'd be curious to maybe unpack that at some point, but I think for the sake of time, maybe we roll on today. I think, Laura, you were next.
You're muted, I think.
Yeah, thanks. You should hear me through David's speaker now, or David's microphone. Hi. Thank you for this lovely paper. My question is about, I wanted to zoom out a little bit out of like this particular paper into a trend in science and technology studies to craft these kinds of experiments, to sort of host collaborative workshops, create venues for collaboration with others, and so on. And I think I read it in the paper as well, that of course you guys have done that very successfully, and that may also be a bit due to the Danish context, but I often see that we have sort of this idea that, if we only open our doors, the world is going to want to work with us. And I'm not always sure that is the case anymore, and I wanted to hear a little bit from you what your feelings, or what just a statement on, are we still at the same place that we were, roughly 10 years ago or so, that the paper came out, or that you worked on the paper in the beginning or first, to now? Has it become more difficult to collaborate with people? Has it become easier? Do you see potentials for, participatory data design to especially also be used in moments where we are, at large differences? So Matt also mentioned that in his introduction, that it seems we're at a time of like particular crises right now, particular diffraction of the public. So is there sort of, can we use that in a time like that? Or has it become sort of maybe a more difficult time to do participatory data design?
That's a great question. Another great question. I think that, you can point to things that have become both easier and more difficult. So, of course, on the one hand, that more and more data is, or around 2000, you would have the idea that now we have a lot of data, we will have increasingly more, and it will be a bonanza for social science. So now we can trace everything will be digitally mediated, and we can trace it and explore it. That is going to be a new empirical era for social science. That's going to be great. Obviously, that didn't happen. A lot of platforms made their data increasingly proprietary. So also on top of that, sort of with the increasing discussions about surveillance capitalism and surveillance state, there was an impetus on protecting the rights of citizens. So in EU we have the GDPR and other things that make it difficult to just get your hands on a lot of data. But then on the other hand, that's and some of the things that are making it more difficult. On the other hand, there are also constantly tools and developments that make it more easy to get a lot of data. So, for instance, a simple thing like speech to text translation. Suddenly you can make your own recordings, and suddenly you have a lot of textual material to work with. And also, I think what we're doing with our master education is essentially to use our poor students as Trojan horses to get into organizations where they can, through their position there, can get access to a lot of data. So I think there are trends in many straws in the wind here, but I think there are always opportunities to try to get some people together to discuss some data in a meaningful way. So I think that still holds. But of course everything here is constantly related to broader discussion about. I mean, for instance, 5-10 years ago, it was very recognizable it was almost like a free lunch to say, I'm against new public management, and people would love you immediately. Now there's constant questions about surveillance or what kind of data is being appropriated for AI and so on. Really important discussions about bias and all that. So none of these are the context for these things are always in the broader context of wildly ranging societal discussions about what kind of digital futures do we want. Digital sovereignty is a new big thing in Europe. So I think that's kind of a condition for our work. There were never controversy-free times, but I think there are still lots of opportunities to do stuff or some version of this.
The other thing, if I could just jump in there, in my private sector consulting, one of the things that I actually see is, I think because of the ChatGPT experience, there are many more people now who have an interest in working with an unstructured data than I used to encounter.
Mm-hmm.
Many people have learned that you can now manipulate that and turn it into something of value. And so I'm certainly seeing a lot more people interested in exploring the vast trove of information that exists, within, say, an organization compared to the past. And so I think actually, at least in my context, with my private consulting, I think that's actually opened up a number of opportunities that have been interesting. But I think we have one last question. Hannes?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Torben, for diving into this paper. It really took me down of memory lane. Most of these projects took place when I was in TANTlab, so that was great. Thank you for that. I actually had a question about the whole consultancy thing, but I think I'd rather come back to the discussion about online and offline, because that is something that I'm struggling with a bit more myself. And I think there's something interesting about that we are bringing the online offline, but also what happens when we make these visualizations. For example, we make it, I think David touches a little bit upon this earlier in an early question, but we make it less medium specific in a sense that we're moving the user further away from the medium by taking the data out and making visualization that construct the data in a completely different way than it was constructed on the site where, for example, Facebook, where it was originally. So we're moving further away from the affordances, for example, of that digital space. So I'm interested in the whole, are we moving too far away from the experience, and not just the data experience, but also the lived life online, like the data experience of how it feels to be with the data for the users, for example. So and the everyday life online. So I'm curious if some of these visualizations, for example, and the aggregation or the datascape, maybe it's also a question to Mathieu, but are we taking the user too far away from their everyday life and their data experience on the medium specific platforms?
Yeah. I think I would love to hear Mathieu's answer to this. I'll just quickly say that something along what I said about digitization and datafication. I think a workshop like the ones we're describing here is an opportunity to take some data as a starting point and try to translate it, datafy it, explore it in different ways. So there are so many different avenues where you can go, and each of these translations is both sort of is also always implicitly a betrayal of the origin, but it's also taking it somewhere else where you can do something new with it. So I would tend not to think that there is some kind of authenticity that needs to be protected. Instead, I would say, okay, let's have different translations, explorations, visualizations, and so on, and then let's talk about where that can take us, rather than say that there's sort of a baseline or a ground that we need to stick with in order to understand things properly. So I would, to quote Latour, the more mediations, the better. But of course, the game is to understand what do all these mediations do and what can we do with them. Do you have any thoughts on this issue, Mathieu?
I will just support the questioning. For me, the way I'm thinking of it is we have a motivation for doing something like participatory data design. We want to make an intervention, and we know from STS the STS way to get that is we will create the displacement, a move in how people delegate certain things to technology. So, well, the motivation is of course to have people use technology in a different way, in a way that is less utilitarian. So that the reason why we would make interfaces is that they are more involved in the process of the fabrication of the data and so on. But this move also has externalities, like unintended consequences that we have to live with, and those are mysterious. I am still not completely aware or at peace with what we unintendedly, unwillingly made with that move, and I don't think I know fully what's going on.
Yes, I think that is actually a very nice place to end this discussion. We don't fully know what is going on, and that, I think, captures very much the spirit of what we want to do here. Papers are just papers at some point in time, but the issues keep bumbling on. I think I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to thank my co-host. I think it was a very enjoyable walk down memory lane, as Anders said, but also a walk towards the future, to think about how are these issues evolving and how can we engage people in working with data and with us. So it was a great pleasure. I think we had a nice launch of our paper series, and as you know, we run this for 10 Wednesdays altogether. The next one is already next week. It will be a paper called Experiments with the Data Public. It will be a further dive into the project in Aalborg Municipality that Anders Kuhl and Anders Munk did, discussing all the different issues that come up when you throw yourself in the midst of a digital or not just a digital, but also a very highly politicized process. So I'm looking forward, hopefully, to seeing some of you next week. Thank you so much for asking really great questions and for participating today. So thank you.